कभी करती हैं मुलाकातें, कभी करती हैं मुलाकातें, कभी यादों में बरसातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें। मन की गहरी झील में कूद जाती हैं कभी, सोच के दरिया के संग संग बहती जाती हैं कभी। चाहे शाम हो या हो रातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें।
Our guest today has the propensity of taking one through gritty reality to worlds that are dreamlike and imaginative, all with great felicity and almost with the kind of simplicity as if it was a. We are delighted to have on our show Rana Dasgupta, the author of Tokyo Cancelled and Solo. Welcome to the show, Rana.
I'm delighted to be here, thank you.
Let's start with Tokyo Cancelled first. 13 stories put together. People have likened you to Chaucer and to Borges. How do you feel about that?
Well, the book consciously invoked Chaucer and Boccaccio and these sort of people because it was a book that I wrote when I had just moved to Delhi from, I'd lived in several countries. I was trying to write something that would connect together the kind of places that I'd lived in. And when I was looking for a sort of universal language, I inevitably went back to folk tales and fairy tales, which we all understand wherever they seem to have come from. And so I wrote a set of travelers' tales, or a book of travelers telling tales from various places in the tradition of Chaucer, as an attempt to create a kind of global form of literature.
13 stories. What is the secret of 13?
I wanted an uncomfortable number. One of the numbers that comes up again and again in fairy tales, but maybe it's not the comfortable number we expect. I don't know, I grew up in a house numbered number 13, and it doesn't seem uncomfortable to me. So.
And also one of the characters has 13 children.
Yes, well, the number 13 is one of the things that links all these stories. There's a question in the book about whether all these places which are part of the same global capitalist system are really in communication with each other or not. And one of the questions that was in my mind at the time was, what does global culture look like? What would a global culture look like? Are we linked only by economic processes, but we remain essentially ignorant of each other in cultural and human ways? So in the book, the characters are all quite obsessed with their own local dramas, and they don't really know much about what's going on in the other places. But the number 13 keeps cropping up in all their stories as a way of sort of subconsciously linking them, or providing links with them even despite themselves.
And breaking the myth of number 13. And
as an unlucky number, yes.
What is it about fairy tales, about a dreamlike world that really attracts you to it? What were the kind of books you were reading?
Well, when I was writing that book, I was extensively reading folk tales and fairy tales from all over the world, and also myth. And I think what I was trying to write was a mythology of contemporary capitalism. I wanted to, and it felt to me that both in the sense of childhood and the return to childhood stories, but also in the return to ancient things. That our world was mythic and could be talked about in mythic terms, not only in the sort of very realist terms that we've become accustomed to reading about it, but it had all kinds of mythic power that even things like advertising, they're always referring to mythic things, the eternal youth or whatever kinds of mythic promises that lie latent in global capitalism. So I wanted to kind of make that explicit and take us back to all those sort of folk tales. But as I say, also I think you know, when you try to scrape away all the layers of cultural difference and everything, one of the things you can end up with is folktale and myth. That's where we seem to understand each other quite well. And I was looking in a way for that kind of connection between different places.
So this connection that you find between different places is also in a way very distinct. So where do you find that global or universal thread that binds it all together?
For me, one of the questions throughout my writing career has been what is the responsibility of a writer at this point in time in this age of globalization? Because it seems to be that it's both a very local responsibility and a universal responsibility. So if you are not interested in the specificities of place and people and the way they speak and behave and everything, then you lose out really on life, because that's where life is located for most of us. But if you're only interested in a very bounded reality, a very limited reality, then you miss out on lots of other things, which is to say that somehow people's stories are able to speak way beyond their geography. And the fact also that we live in a world where we have connections, whether we like it or not, to people everywhere else in the world. We buy products that are made by them. We consume our links with other people in lots of different ways. And so it seems to me that we should be interested in those other people and trying to think about how they can be represented in literature. So for me, one of the sort of red herrings of how writers are described is the nation. Because in a way, the nation seems to be both too big and too small to encapsulate where we are. The book I've just written, for instance, is about Delhi because I can write about Delhi. It's a manageable reality, but India is a very difficult reality. It just encompasses too much experience. But on the other hand, the nation is too small because I feel like we are constantly every day living in realities that come from far away, far further away than that.
It is true when you talk about this book of yours that is going to be published soon, The Capital. You talk about Delhi and you look at it not in terms of its architecture as much as you do in terms of the fiscal realities of Delhi. And what is interesting is that in your first book, you have in your acknowledgements acknowledged Delhi as the fecund ground from where writing started happening to you. But you came to The Capital much later. In between, you wrote Solo.
No, all three of my books were written in Delhi, and it was quite unexpected. I moved here from New York, which is where I was living before, and I found that suddenly in Delhi I could write in a way that I felt New York didn't allow me to at all, just because the industry of writing was so enormous and impressive in that city, both in terms of the media corporations that sort of produced and marketed books, but also in terms of the celebrity of people who lived in the city and wrote. And Delhi in 2000 was a place where one could write very, uninterrupted, with no one really caring what you were doing, far away from the pressures of literary fads and all that sort of thing. So I found it a wonderful place, actually, to let my imagination.
So is that why you came to Delhi?
So I moved here because I was in love with someone who lived here. I didn't expect to stay. I thought I'd be here about 3 months and then leave, and it's been 13 years. And one of the reasons I stayed was because I found that this was a very interesting place from which to look at the world, not only to look at this place, but to look outwards at the world too.
So when you write about Delhi, as you said, it's easier to write about Delhi than to write about India because that's a larger canvas. But does it somewhere also for you really represent India when you write about The Capital?
Well, I mean, I think my latest book is an attempt to write a portrait of Delhi, and I tried to do it because I realized that when people would ask me what it felt like to live in Delhi, I had no satisfying answer for them. That the reality of living in the city was so much more intense than anything that I could deliver in a 20-minute conversation, and I wanted to try and express what that intensity meant. And as I sort of unpacked my own feelings, I realized that it was an intensity not only of daily experience, but also of deep histories of the place, and the sort of media world that added a lot of velocity to the space. And I think a lot of the uncanniness of a city that's finding itself and changing every day and being ripped down and rebuilt, and all these things went together to make the intensity of people's days in this city. And so I think some of this is entirely local. I mean, the experience of partition and the Sikh riots is very foundational to the book, the account I give of life in Delhi. It structures a lot of the consciousness of the city, the fear and paranoia that people have about each other, which is different from other Indian cities. But much of the economic side of it would be common to most Indian cities, and indeed many cities in other countries too. And in a way, I offer this book not just as an account of Delhi or even Indian cities, but as an account of new emerging realities that are changing the entire global system. Because the experience of Delhi is probably more similar to the experience of Moscow and Beijing than those are to New York or Paris or London, which have sort of dictated the terms of capitalism and global aesthetics for a long time. So Delhi is just one example of very new attitudes to this entire structure that we're all part of.
What did you expect in Delhi when you came here first? Was this the kind of Delhi you really imagined it to be?
Well, I think what again, this is 2000, so it's a city that we hardly remember now because it's just changed so much. I mean, it was a city where, for instance, there was nowhere to go out. I mean, most people, apart from five-star hotels, there was basically sitting at home with friends and not going out, except cinemas. I mean, that was pretty much the only thing that people did going out. The entire culture of restaurants and bars and all that sort of thing has very much happened since that. But what really astonished me when I landed here was the energy and intensity of conversation and debate, because I think, again, this was a moment when the city was really turning into something, and we didn't know what it was going to turn into. So people from all walks of life and all kinds of political and professional persuasions had opinions on what it should turn into. They were debating it. There were furious arguments about how we should be living in the city, and a feeling that it could be an example to the world, in a sense. The whole tradition of Indian critiques of imperialism and of the West gave this sense that when we did capitalism, we would do it better. We would do it in
when we become the economic superpower, which is always around the corner all the time in all our discussions.
Exactly. We would have a better city, a better reality, a more humane capitalism. And all that. So there were all these debates going on, and I realized that that in a way the facile assumptions that I'd lived with most of my life growing up in the West about what capitalism was and what the future meant and all that kind of stuff had to be undone and rebuilt. And it was very exhilarating being here. It was a great place to think about writing books. Because it was philosophically very alive, and people were just in this churn of ideas and personal change and development. That I hadn't expected. I thought I was coming from the center of the world to some sort of far off, tin pot town.
With elephants roaming on the roads and horses all the time. Is that what you expected?
Well, I'd visited here all my childhood, but I think I wasn't. I wasn't prepared for quite how energetic an intellectual and cultural centre it was going to become, and the art scene exploded very soon after that, and I found it incredibly creative. And people were starting, they were starting new magazines and publishing houses. They were starting galleries. They were starting businesses, and they were all young, and there just seemed to be endless kinds of.
And also, Indian English writing was beginning to build itself up to what it is today.
Well, Arundhati Roy had won the Booker just 3 years before I arrived here, so there was a sense of possibility in amongst lots of people in the city, and life was very cheap, which is sort of a precondition for a scene of this sort. And a lot of people who who were now established writers and artists, were then doing other kinds of work to earn their money, but on a part-time basis, which gave them a lot of time to think and chat and create. So that sense that I had in New York, that writing a novel was sort of economically impossible because you spent your entire life trying to pay your rent and everything like that. For a window of time in Delhi, that wasn't the case. So people had quite a lot of leisure time, and you could rent a Barsati for 1,500 rupees or 2,000 rupees a month or something like that. So there was that scene which I came into, which was full of possibility and full of encouragement to other people who had ideas.
Did you ever feel that you were somewhere coming back home? Did you suddenly feel that you were back to your roots?
Well, if I'd ever felt that before I arrived, that was dashed as soon as I came, because I felt I was, my links are to Calcutta. That's the city that I visited in my childhood. Mm-hmm. And here I felt a real foreigner. It just the geography of it, the languages of it were not mine, and so.
And the English we speak is different.
Well, I could understand the English.
But did people understand you? It's not just the accent. It's
a demeanor.
Yes,
yeah.
And also the lingo. What words mean to us are different.
No, it was amusing. Because I'd always grown up being labelled Indian, mm-hmm. and it was funny to come here and be completely not recognised as Indian, both because of the way I dressed or the way I spoke or whatever. It's been 13 years now, so this place is very much home to me. But when I arrived, I was discovering it very much as a foreigner, which was also very exhilarating, because I think one of the things that happens in a city like Delhi is that over time, as you become more settled here, your horizons reduce, and there are just a few corridors that you travel between, and you find yourselves meeting the same people.
Did that happen to you?
But when I arrived, I didn't know where these corridors were, so I would go all over the city. My newfound friends would be kind of astonished that I ended up in those places. Mm-hmm. And so I wandered around and took loads of photographs and made notes for my novel, and I was much more porous to the city than I am now.
This is a new voice for you compared to your other works. When you've written solo, it's in a different voice. Do you feel that?
My new book? Yes, it's first of all a book of non-fiction. Mm. So for the first time, I'm not only talking about real people and real experiences, but non-fiction introduced all kinds of new sorts of responsibilities and debts, mm-hmm. Where you have to take responsibility for people's confessions and stories. People who've spoken in this book have done so sometimes at some risk to themselves. Women who've spoken about their marital situations, for instance. Mm-hmm. So that introduces all kinds of new reasons not to sleep at night. But also, it's a personal account, and I'm very much in that account. My own parents' stories is in the book, and my own feelings about what I see, and so I'm much more undisguised than I was in my previous books. And I wouldn't have been able to do that several years ago. It's taken me 2 books to sort of feel that it's okay to show myself. I mean, I wrote my first book to disguise myself and conceal myself, but I think that's a sort of a debate or a balance that all writers sort of seek over their writing careers, is how much.
Why did you feel the need to disguise yourself?
Because it's just not my personality. I don't wish to be known, really. I don't write to be known. I don't write to advertise myself or make public my feelings about things. And so one of the things about fairy tales and folk tales, which the first book was made up of, is that they're deeply unpsychological. There's no psychological debate, really. There's just situations. When the prince and the princess fall in love, they have to do that because they're the prince
and they have to be happily ever after.
Interiority, that's right.
Which is not the case in Solo. You take us to Sofia, to the world of Ulrich, which is now it's hard-hitting reality.
Mm.
Tell us something about that.
Yeah, for my second book, I mean, after this book of folk tales, I mean, I did deliberately want to, after never having gone inside the heads really of my characters, I wanted to spend the whole book inside the head of one character, and to
and you see the world through, to quote you or paraphrase you, the watery eyes of a 100-year-old man who's obsessed with chemistry, and you've named your chapters
after
chemical elements.
Yeah, it's a very different. It's a novel. I mean, it's sort of a classical sort of novel in that it looks at a long period of time, and it looks at a character in the context of history and epic events, and it's set in Bulgaria. It was written in Delhi, so Bulgaria was far away. So it was a different kind of exercise. And Bulgaria was a country I'd become somewhat obsessed with. So I had this 4-year obsession with this country while I was writing this novel. An obsession which began with music, and there's a lot of music in the book.
Yes, in fact, the book is made up of 2 movements.
Yeah.
The first movement, which is kind of more gritty, and then you go into the imaginative world, which is kind of not so dark.
Yeah, I think this is a book about melancholy. I mean, it's a feeling that for a certain period of my life was one that I wanted to write about and describe and get out. And it's a melancholy of history, really. I mean, he's made to be 100 years old, so we have he can talk about a lot of history. And the Bulgarian 20th century was quite violent, and so there were lots of things going on. I mean, one was that I wanted to dispel a very Anglo-American vision of history, which is to say that the 20th century was great, basically, and it was a time of progress and triumph, and everyone did well. And this is a feeling that's almost unique to England and America. I mean, they are the countries for which this is most true, but for very large parts of the world, the 20th century was a time of chaos, and say for Bulgaria, I think, stepping backwards. I mean, it actually had its most glorious moment at the very beginning of that century, and the rest of the century was just swinging between various kinds of political opposites and confusion and chaos. So in the midst of it, I mean, one can read that as history, but when you see individuals moving through all that, they live much less well than they could have in different political circumstances, and there's a melancholy about everything that they didn't live, everything they lost out on. So my character, there are these 2 movements. One is about his life, and the other is about his daydreams, the things he didn't live.
But could have lived.
And could have lived in another scenario, yes.
All your works are totally distinct from each other and very interesting. I hope our viewers do get a chance to pick these books up, and all the best for Capital, which is going to be out soon.
Thank you very much.
And thanks for being on our program.
Thank you very much.
Rabia realized suddenly that they had not even checked what picture was showing. She spelled out the name on the poster stuck to the front of the theatre. An unknown actor and actors were standing in a tight embrace. She didn't recognize the men. Was it Jaisankar or Shivaji? But Uma put an end to her dilemma. What does it matter who it is? It's a picture to see, that's enough. Ahmed returned with the tickets. Right, come on, let's go in, Madina said. As they stood at the gate, waiting to hand in their tickets, Rabia picked Ahmed not to tell anyone that they had come to pictures that day. When he said, "Che, would I do that?" he seemed to be really kind. The ticket collector looked at the 3 girls with a curious smile. Well, girls, come to see the picture, have you? Go in then, go in. He opened the tin gates for them. The instant they entered, they could perceive nothing in the half light. There were certainly plenty of men occupying the men's seats, but the women's seats were totally empty. Madina began to get frightened. I'm scared. There is no one here. How can just the three of us sit here? She held on tightly to Rabia's shoulder. The picture had started to run on the screen. Rabia hurried towards a bench. Come and sit down, she said. The three of them sat huddled together. To their surprise, a series of ugly and deeply embarrassing scenes appeared on the screen. Two women seemed to be bathing all the time. The girls were deeply shocked by it all. Sometimes they actually had to bury their faces in their laps to avoid looking at the screen. They were well aware that the men turned around frequently to look at them. Every time they looked up, they could neither avoid the shameful scenes shown on the screen nor the sharp glances of the male audience. The sheer humiliation of the situation they found themselves in made them wish to die that very instant. On top of all this, Rabia's stomach churned at the thought of her family and her mother. Madina asked, shall we just leave quickly and go home? We can't, said Rabia. They've locked the gates. They'll open them only when the picture is over. For her part, Uma was not in quite such a desperate state as the other two. She felt a little bit braver because she at least had taken her mother's permission. Besides, she wasn't doing something deeply sinful by going to the cinema in the month of Ramzan. She jumped to her feet with relief, ready to go home as soon as the picture finished. Rabia pulled at her and made her sit down again. Wait, Dee, let's wait for all the men to go out before us. They'll only stare at us if we join them now. 10 minutes after the theatre emptied, the girls crept out quietly. Their faces looked changed, shocked and terrified. Ahmad had gone outside. It was packing. The sun dazzled their eyes. Madina's hand gripped Rabia's as they walked along the street. Uma alone appeared to go her way without being tormented by guilt.